Thank you, Shai. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities and the Leer Jerusalem Institute for inviting me to speak to you today about the over or under regulation of biomedical research conundrum. Now, let's be sincere about it. Regulation talk is not terribly exciting, and grievances about over or under regulation may come across as tedious sometimes. Nevertheless, I boldly took it upon myself to make a few, hopefully valuable comments on the topic. So let's start. The first question that springs to mind is whether anyone is in fact content with the current state of affairs. The over-under regulation critique, which is highly evaluative and subjective, in fact leads us to perceive things, to see things that excessive or lacking regulation is in the eye of the beholder. So we have over-regulation concerns voiced by researchers and sponsors, both from the pharma industry and the AI healthcare tech, and under-regulation concerns are voiced by bioethicists, by ethics-aware patient groups, and sometimes by regulators themselves. I would like to very briefly, lay out the purported effects of both over and under regulation. We'll start with over regulation. The most intuitive or common claim here is that excessive, complex, cumbersome regulation, dubbed by some as hyper-regulation, coupled with research ethics committees or institutional review boards' misguided emphasis on form over substance, leads to a disservice to society. And in fact, it is claimed that overregulation stifles clinical research, has a chilling effect on scientific progress, and therefore some even conceive it to be a threat to public health. In the words of Charles Warlow here, Charles Warlow calls overregulation a modern obsession with the rights of individuals as opposed to their responsibilities to the society that nurtures them, an obsession with accountability and the administrative control of professional life. I myself do not subscribe to this view, but this is how it is perceived by some researchers. Another thing is that of over-proceduralization, red tape, as Shai mentioned it, bureaucratic overload, which of course is naturally factored into the attractiveness of a country's research climate. This in turn hinders competitiveness of countries in this field. Overregulation also renders clinical trials prohibitively expensive, thereby driving out independent academic researchers, those without industry sponsorship, and creating professional disparities and exclusion of low-funded researchers. Also, John Merritt interestingly claims that a potential effect of overregulation is that of a moral shake-off by investigators regarding the responsibility to their ethical conduct. That is, once research is being approved by an IRB, investigators may be or may perceive themselves to be off the moral hook and unaccountable for the ethicality of the research. This, of course, does not apply to everybody, but some may perceive it as such. A second order point here is that the actual ethical efficacy of IRBs or RECs, the whole mechanism for ethical review of biomedical research, may in fact be, well, skeptics in fact question whether it actually improves the ethical quality of research. And this is mainly attributed to poor transparency standards and to the significant variability in ethics committees' opinions, which renders the analysis of IRB's performance rather challenging for measuring. Now, what about under-regulation? Under-regulation is not as this critique is far less nuanced than the one of over-regulation. Nevertheless, it claims that under-regulation is less costly for researchers and sponsors, involves lighter scrutiny, and allows for speedier timelines for conducting research. But under-regulation may also generate poor quality research, chaos and uncertainty, leave research subjects and societal interests insufficiently protected, And under-regulation also carries lingering consequences of past exploitation, which in turn creates mistrust in medical practitioners and health authorities. And this carries public health implications, as we've seen in the latest COVID pandemic crisis. For instance, when public health authorities in the US tried to prioritize vaccine rollout within the African American community, this encountered vaccine hesitancy issues, which are related to issues of trust. Concerns over the intentions of the US government go back to the 20th century medical experiments on Black people, the Tuskegee trials, and others. Now I'd like to give you very briefly what is broadly discussed in this in the review which Shai introduced. Selected regulatory approval pathways for clinical trials and perhaps even health data research somewhere from a comparative perspective. So let's take the issue of genetic research. Genetic research in Israel, the review pathway for genetic research involves a two-tiered route. First, it needs to be approved by an IRB, and then the Supreme Helsinki Committee needs to approve it, and then it needs to be granted a final regulatory approval by the Director General of the Ministry of Health. For the UK, DNA analysis of existing samples without consent from DNA source require first the anonymization of those samples, and only then an NHS Research Ethics Committee's approval is sought. For samples stored with identifying information, ethical approval is required, and for research on anonymized extracted DNA, no ethical approval is required unless there are ethical complexities whereby ethical review could be voluntarily sought. In the US, an IRB approval is required for genetic research, and genetic studies this reflects a genetic exceptionalism approach, again, are considered ones which cannot be automatically classified as minimal risk, and therefore they're excluded from expedited review pathways. What about gene therapies? In Israel, gene therapies require the approval of an IRB and a designated Ministry of Health Central Committee for Advanced Therapies. In the UK, the GTAC, the Gene Therapy Advisory Committee, needs to approve novel therapies, and it is excluded from the fast-track review. This is a risk-based approach. And in the US, an FDA investigation on new drug application would need to be filed first, and only then would with the new gene therapy go to the IRB committee in order to be reviewed and approved there. There's no designated genetics expert committee like in the other two countries. What about expedited or fast-track review pathways? These are highly appealing for both researchers and sponsors. In Israel, there is no established fast-track review, save for a quasi-expedited review by a Helsinki subcommittee, and this is exclusively for research on retrospective health data. In the UK, replacing the traditional pathway requiring both an MHRA, the relevant regulator, and a Research Ethics Committee's approval, the NHS Health Research Authority has launched a fast-track review in 2022 for research of urgent public health issues such as COVID-19 and monkeypox later on, and for global clinical trials in phase 1 or 2 in healthy volunteers or patients. As for the US, a risk-based expedited review pathway exists for research involving no more than minimal risk, and one which requires only a limited IRB review, typically for secondary research, and where the review is focused on broad consent. Now, as for the availability of appeal mechanisms for ethics committees' decisions, ethics committees' decisions are binding and typically final, and having the recourse of appeal is something which is highly significant and important for both for reinforcing the legitimacy of the ethical review process and for enhancing sentiments of fairness and justice for researchers and sponsors alike. So what do we have here? Israel has no such appeal mechanism for unfavorable ethics committees' decisions. The UK has such established appeal mechanism, and the US has no established appeal process, but some institutions can voluntarily implement such a process through a designated appeal IRB. Having very briefly looked comparatively at those frameworks for different regulatory approval pathways, the question is, have we learned anything from this about the about the favorability of a country's research climate? Or are we, in other words, are we asking the right question? So I would argue that perhaps we're not. And I suggest the following conclusions. The first one is that the rhetoric of over and under regulation is far too simplistic. It does not satisfy any needs we have in order to understand or process whether a given climate is in fact favorable or not. Then perhaps a more nuanced risk-sensitive regulation is in place, since we've already rejected the one-size-fits-all regulatory approach, understanding that research with different interventional depths require different review and approval pathways. So the European Commission has conducted a study in the US and in the EU, and the study findings were that they're not in favor of a strictly risk-adapted framework, and that there are other considerations that are other than high or low risk for study subjects, and that research regulation and oversight should be proportionate to the ethical concerns raised by the given research. This may be the right direction, in my opinion. However, this proportionality requirement is rather vague and should be more specific in order to be implemented into practice. Now, the third thing is that a favorable regulatory climate should be measured not only by the weight of the regulation or its intelligibility, but also by other factors such as the flexibility and adaptability of this framework. That is, whether it has legislative review of regulatory frameworks for clinical trials and health data research, whether such framework is in fact responsive to evolving research trends, emerging analytic technologies, and new data pools. And this also has another benefit or merit by the fact that it allows stakeholders to have a voice, to be a part of the discussion which leads to the revitalization of this existing framework. And this democratized process is highly important for researchers and for the public alike. So I have here a few examples of recent projects for revitalization of clinical trials and data research regulatory frameworks. You can see here the 2020 initiative for Australia of cell tissue and gene therapies regulatory framework. For the EU, we have the clinical trial regulations and the new European health data space ecosystem, including the Data Governance Act from 2020. In the UK, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agencies has issued a public consultation to improve and strengthen UK's clinical trial legislation in 2022. Israel has its draft patient rights regulations. You see, I'm a bit hesitant because this is still in draft form, unfortunately. But this was supposed to strengthen and create unique pathways for approval of health data, for review and approval of health data research in Israel. And the US has the revised common rule from 2018. Another thing is that it's not just the flexibility and adaptability of regulatory frameworks, but also, perhaps even more importantly, whether a given framework in fact endorses scientific advances. That is, whether it adopts a daring enthusiasm approach or a more precautionary approach of conservative skepticism regarding scientific advances. So for human genome editing, and this is very wordy, so I'll just give you the bottom line for each country. So for human germline gene editing in Israel, it is prohibited in the Cloning Act, and therapeutic somatic gene editing is impliedly permitted. For the UK, clinical human germline gene editing is illegal. However, research involving human embryos outside the body is permitted under the permission of the relevant regulator, the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, which in fact has granted such a license back in 2016. And somatic genome editing is permitted. In the US, human germline gene editing is not outrightly banned. However, it is indirectly hindered by prohibition on federal funding for such trials. And impliedly, there are no laws or regulations banning such research from being conducted through private funding. However, several US states did enact some laws governing or banning research using human embryos. And as for somatic genome editing, this is considered to be a form of gene therapy and therefore regulated by the FDA. In France, clinical human germline gene editing is prohibited, while research is permitted. In Germany, perhaps the strictest, Germany is famous or notorious for its rather restrictive frameworks for biomedical research. So human germline gene editing is prohibited, and the law also prohibits basic research on modified gametes as well as fertilization, the creation of research embryos and such. And in Sweden, human germline gene editing is prohibited under the Act of Genetic Integrity, and somatic genome editing seems to be permitted under new regulations. So what are the potential consequences of restrictive research climates? The European Parliament has recently issued a survey of genome editing in humans, and it has concluded that potential consequences of such restrictive climates are avoiding unfavorable research climates by delocalization of research to more permissible jurisdictions through research collaborations, and circumventing restrictions through cross-border procurement of products and services through informal private channels. This is, of course, specific for human genome editing, but it could equally apply to other fields of research. Another research looking into prohibited research practice across European countries. I'll give you a very few examples here. In vitro research on human embryonic stem cells is prohibited in Lithuania, Ireland, Italy, Poland, and Turkey. In vitro culture of human embryos for research is prohibited in Austria, Germany, Italy, Malta, Poland and Slovakia and others. And the derivation of cell lines from human embryos is also prohibited in, I think it's almost the same, if not identical, list of countries. Lastly, a point to consider. Those ethical review mechanisms may also have a social function to play. And this is where those committees can actually, or those committees backed by appropriate regulation, can take up commitment to social justice, fairness and equality in healthcare. And this can be done through inclusivity efforts, which are meeting structural and systemic misrepresentation, historical misrepresentation in research of underrepresented, marginalized populations, ethnic minorities and such. These can be included in research through such efforts of equity and diversity. We have here a few examples. For the US, the 1993 NIH Revitalization Act requiring the inclusion of women and minorities in clinical research, and the NIH policy and guidelines from 2017 from the same inclusion, and more recently the 2020 guidance of the FDA to enhance diversity in clinical trials and encourage inclusivity in research. You can see here an example of an IRB statement of commitment as incorporating such social commitment of inclusion. You can see here at the bottom, as an IRB, we will strive to support investigator and institutional efforts to ensure diversity, promote inclusion, and drive health equity. In the UK, there is also the National Institute for Health Research Include program from 2020, I think, and the UK Health Data Research Alliance from 2020, which calls for the inclusion of all population groups in the data collected to assure research outcomes are representative, inclusive, and bias-free. And lastly, an example from Australia. The Australian Clinical Trials Alliance has launched a project aiming to improve clinical trial awareness, involvement, and access with and for people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So to conclude, seemingly the basic components of a favorable research climate, and by favorable I mean both for researchers and sponsors on the one hand and human subjects and society on the other. So firstly, we need to have an intelligible and reasonably weighty regulation. This has to be, to this we have to add other factors such as flexible and adapted regulatory frameworks for such trials, cautiously and responsibly endorse scientific advances, and lastly, that commitment which we've just mentioned to social justice, fairness and equality through diversity and inclusion. Thank you very much.